Hi, everyone. Happy Sunday. I'm Andrea Gehrz, and I'm here with my good friend Alexander Lumiere. And now just tell me, wait, no, well, first of all, I have to tell you, I know Alexander through sign language interpreting. We have been friends for over 20 years. We've been teams on a lot of jobs, and I know that he's an awesome interpreter, and he also is a literary person, does a lot of art and literature work, and is a screenwriter and does a lot of things like that. So wait, what were you just saying? You were saying that written, tell me what you were just saying.
Well, this is all of this will start everything. It's my opinion, for however long we talk. It's my opinion, but translation is after a careful analysis of text, and although it's used in our field, I feel like translation means I looked at this text and analyzed it and dissected it, reconstituted it in language that's being translated to from the language it was being translated from, and it's after careful analysis that I have chosen the exact phrases that I have chosen. And interpretation is somewhat like that, but you do it on the fly. Sometimes we have advanced knowledge of the text, but not often.
Mhm.
And even if we have advanced knowledge of the text that's being used, we don't have advanced knowledge of the way that it will be presented.
So
So that's
sometimes,
how I see those things.
so you're saying a translation is different because you can actually pour over every decision and make, yeah, there's been times where I actually have a team of people where we make a translation decision where if it's confusing or something, I'll talk to like three other people and we'll say,
Yeah.
what should we do with this? And then we decide, let's put a footnote here or let's, so that actually makes a lot of sense. So how can ASL interpretation be successful if you can't make it perfect?
Well, I have to let go of the idea of perfect, to let go of the idea that there is one interpretation and that's it. I believe that I said in your notes that the interpretation you're doing is might be the final product for that moment, but it's still a rehearsal for the next interpretation you do. So it can be modified in any way. And if you don't look at it that way, you're going to decide, an interpreter is going to decide and make choices about their interpretation that may or may not be right. But if they aren't willing to keep looking for the next interpretation, the better interpretation of the thing they did before, it's just going to be like rhetoric. It's not going to go anywhere. It's going to be like a
So, how is it that you can have several translations or interpretations of the same sentence and they can all be effective?
well, I feel that uh, effective means that the client or the reader got the idea, the concepts, and the essence.
Hmm.
I can give you a literary example. The very first translator of Proust's Search of Lost Time was a guy named Moncrief, and he poured over it for like 10 years. And his interpretation was valued because it was the first into English and people loved it, but he tried to get it exactly like the French. So you've got these awkward translations of some French idioms that didn't quite flow in English. The next translation of it, some years later, uh, that got changed. So people complained that it wasn't exactly like the French idioms, but it flowed better and it got the essence of the text clearly than the first translation. I'm reading the first translation now. There's nothing wrong with it. It's great. But those were the complaints.
Hmm.
So I think you have to get the meaning first, and then the tone, the essence, the mood.
Hmm.
I think the easiest thing is the text. The hardest thing is the subtext.
Interesting. Well, so someone in interpreting taught me that there are linear texts and poetic texts. Like a linear text has pretty much one option for translation, like 1 + 1 = 2 might be a linear text, or like the pizza is red or something is like a kind of a linear text. But if you said like something really poetic, like the bird flies among bird, like how some quips are really poetic or whatever,
Yeah,
that a poetic text has more options for interpretation of it because it is poetic. I mean, do you find that when there's poetic parts of the text that it would take several translators, or you could have 10 translators translate it differently, but some might get the meaning kind of, but then some would really get the whole, I don't know, like, see how it's frustrating because translation's an imperfect art, but how can we,
yeah.
you know, like so when you're on the phones interpreting for sign language, how do you know the phone call you're doing is effective?
I think you don't. I think you have sometimes a stony faced person who's just sitting there and they may not even be interested in what's going on. Like it could be a work meeting and they don't want to be there, but they have to log in and they'll just look at you like this. But then you see other people uh, who will sit there like that and then they'll go. So you know that they get it. And there are cues, uh, I think, in people's expressions. I think our main job is watching. So there are cues in people's expressions and the way they move things, whether they look at you or play with their pens or something that show you that you might be getting through. And there's also people going, huh? So just I would look for those cues. Um, for the translation of literature, I'm not sure that that person keeps the audience in mind, but I think for us we have to. And I don't know that there is any one way that we could guarantee that. And you know the old joke about how many interpreters to screw in a light bulb?
Hmm.
That well, how many interpreters does it take to screw in a light bulb? 20. One to put it in, and the other 19 to say, "No, I wouldn't have done it that way."
Well, it's kind of funny because if let's say the text you're translating is super boring and a hearing person would hear it and just be like whittling their twiddling their thumbs at work or what have you, then if you interpret it in a boring fashion, you've actually done an effective translation because you've given a concept equivalent experience to the deaf person. It's like
Yes,
if we're a translator and it's a boring text and we make it super lively, that's actually an error in translation, or
yes, I agree. I think you have to be um, well in video relay work. You're often charged with interpreting uh, uh, what's it called uh, waiver, where it's just a paragraph that the person on the hearing end has to read. They're not reading it as if they know what it means. Often they don't. They're not reading it as if they're excited by it, and you have to do it that way.
hmm.
If you say any reprint or rebroadcast of this, it's not true to the text. It has to be as boring coming this way as it would for anybody. So
Hmm.
I agree. You have to make it boring, and you can't be charged. I think we sometimes are so charged with the responsibility of being effective that we sometimes perform to make it more effective than it is. So
Yeah.
we really wanted it to work. For those of us in the business that really want it to work and really want the deaf user to know that this is a good interpretation, we want to be excited about it ourselves, but we can't let that excitement um, be pervasive to the text. Text has to be whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah, there were parts in the Vettius Valens anthology when, or in the Tetrabiblos, another book where it wasn't super clear. And it's like, is there coffee on the papyrus? Or like, is it that the
Right.
critical edition, which is when they would take whatever was on the papyrus and they make this critical edition, like there's some translation error. It could be that the pages were mixed up. I mean, so you really do have to stay true to what you're reading. And sometimes as the translator, you look like a knob because it comes out in a way that's nonsensical, but you would be making an error to make sense of something that's nonsensical. And so, of course, like I think I figured out at some point to like make a footnote and then say like, hi, this is Andrea Gehrz. Like I was trying really hard in this paragraph, but it's very confusing. I'm not sure what the Greek says at this point. And we do that in sign language interpreting. If like, have you ever interpreted for like a person who is mentally discombobulated?
Yes.
And what do you do there?
Well, I I expand on what I know because of my privilege. So if you're talking about uh, FHA mortgages, and they have no idea what you're talking about, I have to expand on that a little bit because I have some knowledge. My knowledge is limited, but I have some knowledge of FHA mortgages, so I can expand on that and say first-time home buyers, blah blah blah, which may not be what's coming out of the hearing person, but I feel like my privilege is charged with the responsibility of making a cultural bridge, even though it might not seem like a cultural bridge. I feel that's what it is. I feel like we're bridging the the gap between a majority and a minority.
Well, yeah, that's something that interpreters know, expansion. When they call my text of Valens the poetic text, I think Valens was poetic, but because I did expansion and explicitization in certain moments, you don't get stopped from reading the text, so you see how poetic he is. But we actually are trying to do that in like cultural mediation, right? Like if the like let's say
Yeah,
like this, like an introduction to the Tetrabiblos. I make an introduction section about the Greek cosmology, and I talk about how the cosmology was seen and everything. And I'm doing some cultural mediation there, so that when you read the Greek, you understand what they said. And I think I learned that from sign language interpreting. We do that all the time, or like, but some people would say that we're adding stuff. I mean, what's your critique, or like, how do you think an expansion is adding stuff, or what is it there?
well, I mean, I've heard people accused of that too. I don't know if I've ever been, um, but I don't. You can be charged with adding stuff if any part of your opinion creeps in. If you're just going for meaning all the time and you have to expand because the person doesn't know what a blue-tailed hobbenjogger is, you have to just say what a blue-tailed hobbenjogger is and then be done. You can't say I love them. You can't show any part of what you feel about this thing. But if you are making that, you're just explaining, and that's when you stop.
Hmm.
Then I feel that it's necessary because that's a cultural bridge.
Well, okay, so let's be not the devil's advocate. Let's be at least super critical here. So let's say a blue tail Hobenstalker is not something that every hearing or deaf hearing person knows. It's actually a technical term. I think we culturally expand when it's like something that every hearing person knows, but a deaf person wouldn't know because maybe it's a sound. Maybe it's like
Right.
ping or something like that. Like that's a sound that hearing people know, but a deaf person wouldn't know a ping because they don't hear, right? So that's a
Yeah.
moment where we would expand like ping sounds like e or like ding or like
Yeah.
show.
Right.
But if
Right.
it, Blue Dale Habendocker's not something that a hearing person would know either, then for us to expand on it is kind of adding something.
Right. And you have, I think we have to make that decision. I've been in both positions where I think I need to explain this. I don't need to explain this. And then I make that decision that I think that's what our responsibility is. I was once with a deaf person in their living room who went into the bathroom with the door open. We were friends, and with the door open and came out. And the two of us that were in the living room said, "How long have you been holding that?" They peed. "How long have you been holding that?" Well, the deaf person had no idea that he made noise. So that was an important thing to explain. And they were like, what? So I feel like that kind of bridging is important.
Hmm.
That was not an interpreting situation, it was hanging out, but
Wow. So would you rather have a translator on a written translation who overexpands or who underexpands?
over,
Interesting.
over. And then you choose what you want to retain and not retain.
Interesting.
And in literature, I have an example of this. There are places where people will, in English, refer to a common phrase from another language, Italian, a euphemism or a popular phrase that goes over and over and over, a cliche in that language, and they don't translate it because in that language everybody knows what it means. But I don't understand Italian at all, so I want in parentheses that what they means. So I'd
Interesting.
rather have more knowledge. If I see the thing that says "afangul Charlie," and I know what it means, that's fine. But if I see the English translation, then I have a choice. I can ignore this or be confused by this and read that.
Interesting. Well, so one of the critiques of my translation of Valens is it's like I there's too many words or like I'm adding stuff or whatever. But like here's an example. So they use ancient languages for the planets, and like Mars is like the language Picros, which I think what the other translator did was just pick one. Like if you look in the dictionary, Picros means a bunch of things, but they picked one of those words and used one word. Where I said Mars is under the classification of nocturnal, and it's picros, sharp and pungent, more bitter or unpleasant than was initially expected. So I was critiqued for expanding there, but I actually think picros is a language we don't, or a flavor we don't have, right? So I didn't pick one word for picros. I gave you all of the.
Yeah,
So I agree with you. I think it's a better thing to overexpand than it is to be more terse on the translation, you
I
know.
think you're yes, and it seems to me that the person that or people that chided you for doing that felt that they had made a decision about the meaning of it, and theirs was right.
Right.
So it sounded like ego to me.
Well, a lot of it is they feel like my translation's a lot longer than the other one, and so they keep thinking like I'm adding stuff. But it's I'm doing what we're talking about. It's like expansion, expansion. But like it'll be like a list. It'd be like Mars is, and then in the Greek it's just like a list of all these words. But they're words like that are really long and big. Like it would be like Mars is abstract inflammatorianism. You know what I mean? And like and so
Yeah,
they picked one word for inflammatorianism, and I was just like, Mars is the tendency to get inflamed. That would be my. I use a bunch of
yeah,
words. We do that in sign language all the time, right?
yeah, we do. And I feel like it's the critical person is not chastising you for doing that so much as not being right, which means that they have an opinion about it and you're not matching their opinion.
Hmm.
How can more, I mean, um, more is not always better. There's Anthony Trollope, whose novels are 600 pages long, but uh, anything that helps anyone understand the meaning or the flavor of it is great. And if you understand that meaning already, then you don't need to chew over that text.
Hmm.
The person who doesn't understand, if that text isn't that additional meaning isn't there, they're lost.
Hmm. Yeah.
So you've made that person understand that there are many names for Mars.
Yeah. Well, I see this a lot in sign language interpreters. Like, okay, so young sign language interpreters, let's say the word abstractionism comes up. I see young interpreters sign this for the
Mm-hmm.
whole word, which is abstract. But
Mm-hmm.
as an old interpreter, would you say that that really gets the heart of the word abstractionism?
No, it's either, and I'm just winging it, but like, or
Abstract thinking is what he said, or abstract
yeah,
philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Abstract
one
wisdom.
of those things. Abstract wisdom, or abstract philosophy, or abstract thinking, or decisions, or depends
Wow.
on how it's used, of course.
Right.
But it's this. But I think the young interpreters are saying abstract. I know what that means.
Exactly. So I feel like these other translations, I'm trying to not be critical, but mine has been critiqued. So that this is almost like my rebuttal is like, you can't just take those big long words and make one word out of them and think that that's you really got like abstractionism takes like abstract philosophy, abstract wisdom. I always find abstractionism. That's like me as like abstract point and everything around. I'm not saying mine's right or
Yeah,
whatever. That's just what comes
no,
up.
but it may fit the way you use it.
Right.
And if I was interpreting a class in college where abstractionism came up over and over again, I would change how I sign it each time because it broadens the idea of the concept. So I might say, and then
Abstract.
the next time say abstract thinking, or abstract wisdom, or just to keep varying it so that the client gets all the possible meanings of abstract.
Oh my God, that's so deep. Well, that's what it is like this there's something wrong with these people who think that I'm doing something wrong by expansion because it's like I'm actually giving you the actual meaning or you could say abstractionism was all things connected to being abstract. That like in English that might be or like yeah, abstract thinking could work, abstract philosophy could work, like but you see how it takes like two or three or four or five words to really get that concept over. And my rebuttal to these people is that like your terse translation is not giving you an evolved meaning here. You know what I'm saying? It's giving you the like that would be like saying
Right,
abstract for extractionism. It's just not the same
right.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, there are less options for how you conceptualize the idea
Yeah.
if it's terse.
Yeah.
And I'm not against terse. I love minimalism, but I think in that case you have to give people as much information as you possibly can if you're dealing in abstract concepts.
Right. Well, and it's like if something there are parts of the text that are really mathematical. It'll be like count from this day up to this month, and then and those parts of my translation are just as short as the other guy because there is nothing abstract to be relayed there. It's very concrete. Like count three. Count and like
Mm-hmm.
so. I'm not expanding where I don't need to. It's like I'm not adding stuff when it's a linear thought. It's only when it's an abstract thought that that's happening. Right. How has your
But
interpretation?
that's where, but I mean, I was just going to say that's where people differ on how they would do things when they're abstract thoughts, even in sign language.
Mhm. Yeah, even in English, right?
Yeah.
Like how would you render abstractionism in English?
Well, besides using the word,
Yeah.
I would just say the concept of envisioning things abstractly.
That's amazing.
I mean, that's just off the top of my head, but I mean,
Right.
because a prof has to do that. Say you're talking about abstraction in your field, for all the newbies in the audience, you have to say what you mean. The prof would say abstraction, and unless they were supposed to read it in the homework, the prof wouldn't say abstractionism. The blah 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 blah. If they were supposed to know it already, but if they didn't know it already, the prof would always stop and say abstractionism. The idea of thinking about. So I think it's important to give more people more information.
Yeah. Well, so okay, what do you do when you come up with a technical term? Like when and how do you decide to finger spell something? And what is finger spelling?
What is fingerspelling?
Yeah.
Um, when you there is not a culturally agreed upon or linguistically agreed upon sign for the thing you're trying to say. So I'm Alexander. There's no agreed upon sign for Alexander. I may have a name sign, which is this, but that isn't universally known. So whoever is signing has to fingerspell Alexander, and I fingerspell uh, technical terms, and this happens in video relay service all the time because you have people speaking in jargon about things in their field that aren't necessarily in the real world. So you fingerspell PDM because they know what it means, and if it doesn't make any sense, you just fingerspell, and you hope that that person knows enough about the topic to say, "Oh, PDM, they're due next week." And sometimes there's a sign that is not germane to culturally appropriate sign language, like sprint.
Mhm.
So in business, sometimes they'll say, "Well, the next sprint is June 15th," and they mean a deployment of something, a program, a software update, something, and they say sprint. But the deaf person knows that this means that deployment.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I say sprint.
Yeah. Well, this has happened in the translations like so there's a guy Robert Schmidt who translated Valens first, and he's amazing, he's a genius and stuff, and he did a lot of this. There was this word that came up that could mean it was the night and day class of planets, but the word he chose the word sect, S-E-C-T. But if you look in the dictionary, it's like class, sect, school of thought. That's what you see. And he chose sect. It's this fancy sounding thing. Well, sects became colloquialized among the astrologers, so it became nocturnal and diurnal sect. Now, everyone I meet thinks that I should translate it as sect, and I'm like, okay, that's what Schmidt and a group of people decided this translation was good. I choose the word class, like the night class and day class of planets, because that makes more
Mhm.
sense. Like sect is a little too jargony for what it actually means. It just means the night class of planets. Like you can understand that, right? Like night class.
Yes, absolutely.
But sect, you wouldn't understand. But the astrologers might think I'm doing something wrong because I didn't use sect. Well, he's that would be like me using sprint for like it's hard to explain, but what he had done was basically set up a word or set up a sign for sect instead of using classification, like night classification or day classification. Like it's hard to explain, but I think like yeah, that happens sometimes in even in English, but you have to be like language is a loop. Like that would be if you talking to your readers, like, here you guys, what do you think about sect? And then they're like, oh, I like that, I like that. And we're like, okay, we're using sect for that. But that's for a specific group of people who understand what is going on. My book is written for just the layman who just picks it up and doesn't know, Robert Schmidt or all these people, and they're like, night class of planets. Okay, I understand that. Like, see how they're both correct here, but they're like it's not wrong for the deaf person to say sprint.
No,
Like
because it's an agreed upon sign among them and anybody else in that room.
exactly.
And so, uh, in your case of Schmidt, um, it would be like someone he decided that he was going to talk about pasta sauce, but he's not going to talk about it by listing every ingredient in pasta sauce every single time he mentions it. So he says pasta sauce, and from then on, it's pasta sauce, and people either get the information early or they know that all these ingredients are in the pasta sauce. But imagine if we had to talk about pasta sauce by naming all the ingredients in the pot every single time instead of saying pasta sauce.
Right.
You're you're not losing your readers by picking um, making a choice about how to explain it, because if they don't know what sect means, they're lost.
Exactly. That's why I chose classification because we understand that in English, like the modern colloquial reader who's not in the know with Hellenism. And that's where you do have to know who you're writing to, who is your audience. I mean, my
Right.
audience is just Joe Schmo, where Schmidt's audience was this group of people he was translating for and the Hellenistic astrologers and what have you. But there are times where I actually employ what I would call finger spelling in the word. Like teleology is a word that doesn't exist in English, and you probably don't know what teleology is.
I don't know at all what it means, but I've heard you talk about it.
Okay, so when teleology comes up in the text, or telos, which is a word, I will actually spell telos in the text in italics and then give a footnote with all the dictionary definitions of telos. So it's like I basically finger spell in the text, whereas
Yeah.
what the translators did was like kind of ignore that, or just not really elucidate that, or like I feel like by finger spelling in the text, I'm allowing you all the options, or I really understand a word that doesn't exist in English also. So I think that was an innovation where I just realized one day, wait, I can finger spell in here, you know?
Yes. And you can say telos and have a footnote. If a person knows what it means, they don't need to go to the footnote. But if they don't know what it means, they can find the footnote or the endnote and say, oh, that. Then every time they see it, they're informed.
Right.
So the footnote or endnote is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we finger spell all the time, and then if the deaf person knows the word already, then the finger spelling just goes by them. But if they don't know what the word is, they might have to go look it up, or like what would they do if they
Yeah.
didn't know the word?
Well, often you'll see people to again, like
Oh yeah.
do it again. And if they're not in a meeting and they can talk to the person or finger spelling for it, they might ask, what does that mean? And we see that all the time. Somebody will say, what is that?
Right. A lot of times they know what it means and we don't. Like it'll be like the
Right.
Hobbenjobber, and we spell it Hobbenjobber, and they're like, "Oh yeah," because they're
Yeah.
in the know with these technical things.
Right. In software meetings, I just assume that every deaf person knows what the hearing people are talking about.
Right.
And I figure that they'll give me a clue if they don't. But most of the time they do. They absolutely know what's going on because that happens over and over again.
Hmm. Yeah.
They have monthly meetings and weekly meetings. They sometimes get these same things over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Only the new people would know what it meant.
Right. Fascinating. Okay. I have a list of questions for us. Well, how long have you been an
You're,
interpreter? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're in both worlds. As an interpreter, you're used to coming up with decisions on the fly. And then with the book you translated, you have this opportunity to pour over, which to me seems like a great luxury. You know, the only time we get to do that is if we're interpreting theater.
Yeah. Or frozen text. Let's talk about that.
Yes,
So how do you approach a play when you're interpreting a frozen text? Would you consider a play a frozen text?
yes, uh, but also no, because it's interpreted on the stage in a different way than it's ever been interpreted before. If somebody's doing Hamlet, they're not going to be like any other Hamlet that's ever been interpreted on stage before. So it's frozen in that the words are all the same. But again, I would go for meaning. And my our colleague Jean Miller gave me the most freeing advice. She said, "You love the language of Shakespeare. Let it go. You
Mm.
cannot make Shakespeare language show up on your hands. So let it go." And I'm paraphrasing her now, but that was enormously freeing because what I did was look for meaning and implication and emotion, but in sign language. And I let go of the English. So it's a frozen text because it won't change, but it can change on your hand.
Well, so a frozen text, just for the viewers, is like it's like the Star Spangled Banner is a frozen text, or the Lord's Prayer. It's like a text that is said the same way every time.
Right.
So in that way, it's frozen. But like, but we can. That's where it's a poetic text, right? So it's like you can actually. How many translations of the Star Spangled Banner are there? Do you think in sign
I don't
language?
know if there are any because, I mean, there are a lot, but I don't know for music. But the Lord's Prayer is a good example because it's a frozen text and you don't necessarily want to go for meaning. You want to go for what everyone in that specific church is used to seeing. You don't
Maybe.
want to be you don't want to become more poetic than the previous interpreter last Sunday who interpreted that. They
Right.
want to see the same thing
Right.
because for them it is frozen, and they might follow along in their own, mumbling way. But um,
Well, you have to look at what is the function of it. The text is read, let's say every day at the end of church, they read the Lord's Prayer, and the point is for everyone to read with you, and the deaf person wants to read along. Well, then the point of that use of the frozen text is for read along capabilities, and then each person is making a poem about what it means in their own mind.
right,
So what we want to do is reproduce exactly what that other interpreter did, so the deaf people can copy and sign along. Now, if the Lord's Prayer was used in a play and it was used for a certain poetic meaning in that play, we're not interpreting it for people to copy us. We're interpreting it for the meaning that it's used in that play. So see how
right.
that frozen text takes on a different meaning depending on the intent and use of it.
That's right. Because the play is, I agree, the play is a flexible thing. Frozen text in the church, not. And if I'm not, I don't remember the Lord's Prayer, but if there's a thing in it that says, "Give us this day our daily bread," and you say muffins, everybody in the church is going to go, "What?" So that has to stay that way.
It's interesting to see this where there are mistakes you made. Like in the Star Spangled Banner, you can interpret it 100 ways. Like there are every
Yeah,
person who does the Star Spangled Banner will do it a little bit differently. But if we don't do, if we say like cheese is on bread in our translation, that's an error because that's actually not, like, you can do anything on it as long as it has that meaning of it. It's like kind of weird. And I would say
yeah.
Valens is similar to that. It's like all the translators, we have a different rendering, but we're all kind of dancing around the same meanings basically. It's just weird.
So you're searching for meaning, and then underneath that, that's the text. Underneath that is, does it read? Or any are the subtext.
Hmm.
I love thinking about this stuff. Great.
Well, so I like what you're saying about plays where they're kind of a frozen text, because I think this is more similar to Valens than like the Spangled Banner, because it's like each person who renders that play is going to focus in on different meanings of anything that's poetic. That's anytime there's a double entendre, and that's the thing. Like, my metal producer used to ask me to interpret rap. He's like, "Well, how do you interpret rap when there's like a double or triple entendre?" And I'm like, like, do you perfectly render it so it allows a double entendre in sign language as well, but I don't know how to do that every time. Like sometimes you pick one meaning, like, so it's like I think Valens would be similar to a play where it's like different translators are going to lean into different meanings of each moment kind of thing.
Right. I agree. And I think you have to make the decision about what it means at that time to you or your audience, and then be fine with that.
Right.
And I forget who I mentioned this before, and I think I was wrong. I think it's Dostoevsky said that a translation is new material.
Oh yeah, talk to me about that. You had said that. So
Yeah, and I thought, I don't remember who I said that, but I think it was Dostoevsky or maybe Chekhov said, when there's a translation of one of my books or plays, it's not mine. It's new material with my ideas.
interesting.
So they felt like, because they're so language invested, both of them, both Chekhov, especially Chekhov, I would say, that it's the language that they lived in and grew up with. You take that away and make it accessible, you're making meaning accessible, but not necessarily all the cultural stuff. So I sort of get what they are talking about, but it's a little bit arrogant because the other thing to do is learn Russian so you can read Chekhov, and there aren't going to be many people who want to do that.
Well, you know, I find that with reading Valens, it's actually the best approach to read two translations at the same time and then see
Mm,
what's similar. And then you're like, okay, that's Val. The seed of Valens is this thing that you can get kind of like you're making me think if someone translated my book Astrological Remediation into another language, it would be like a new text because how they choose to render what I said into like French or into Spanish would because each language has its abilities and inabilities. It would like French would have a flair on remediation that plus the translator themselves, so it's like the language itself plus translator plus audience would change the work.
right. And
you
it
know
would change when in 100 years, when somebody retranslates something that you translated into Czechoslovakian, um, it's going to be different, but it's going to have your ideas.
right. God, that's so interesting. Well, okay, what's a chunk? Tell our audience what is a chunk.
A chunk. Oh, that takes me back to the beginning of my studentship. I don't know if that's a word, but anyway, so it's a manageable collection of bits of information that you can hold in your head. It's like before you have to sign it. So it's a little bit like a capacitor in electronics, where it fills up with electricity and then it like a turn signal, and then it sends that thing, and then it fills up again and sends that thing. So a chunk is more like the capacitor.
And I
Is that
think,
right? Is that I
well,
don't even remember. Is that right?
well, totally. I'll explain my view of a chunk. So, a chunk is when a thought form turns into a picture and it's something that we can then send over. So my friend Adeletto told me that it's like words are just code that we use to try to send a picture from our mind over to your mind, right? Like I'm trying to send you the picture of a chunk over here, and I'm using all these words to send over what a chunk is, right? What I'm really
Right.
trying to do is give you a picture of what a chunk is, right? So it's like a chunk is when the thought picture becomes a form. So I'll give you a partial chunk. The book is, you're like, the book is what? Like I don't
That's
know
right.
what
That's
the
right.
book is,
That's that's not a big enough chunk.
Okay, what if I was like, the book is green?
That's a chunk.
You can
That's
interpret that now, right?
I can interpret that now, and I know where I'm going.
What if
And
I said
the book is a morsel.
right?
And if someone said the book is in English, we would just go book itself, and then we would be hanging there.
It's a hanging chunk.
It's a hanging chunk. We'd be waiting for the next thing.
Right. What
We
if I
wouldn't
said
know what to do.
Yeah, like so it what I what, when I was translating Valens, I would actually chunk it. Like I would read until I got a chunk and then I would go ahead and translate that chunk. So what we should see in effective translations is that the chunks are being rendered one like here's the thought form Valens said, here's the thought form. And what I saw in some of the other in like Schmidt was like really wrestling with what is the chunk sometimes. He'd be like, well, I don't know what he means here. And I studied for 15 years to do Valens, and I waited until I could understand the chunk, and then I was like, oh, I know what he means there. And I had to study teleology because they all knew teleology, and we don't know teleology. A teleology is the study of a thing becoming itself, and they talked
Mm.
about telos over and over again. And it's like a telos is a thing that has become itself. And like if you don't understand teleology, you can't get the chunk of what Valens is saying. You're just like, what is he talking about? Like this, like a manifested thing, I don't understand what that means. But once you understand a telos is a thing manifested in itself, you're like, oh, he's like when this person has become themselves, then they XYZ. But the point is, I had to read the Bible in Greek. I had to read this book called Ensoulment about how the soul gets in the body. I had to read all these other books to go back and read Valens again to get the chunk. You know what I mean? So
I, that's terrific.
yeah,
That's terrific. Wow, what dedication.
yeah. Well,
You're a consummate academic.
I'm an obsessed Scorpio. But yeah, I was just obsessed. You get obsessed, aren't you obsessed with Proust right now or something?
I am Proust and Mahler.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Well,
Yes, we're both Scorpios.
Yeah, I know. Our birthdays are like the same day. But I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is an effective written translation could be one that renders the chunks. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, well, yes, but I would say that's the starting place because once you have the chunk, it all alone by itself doesn't necessarily make an arc or a flow or anything. You have to look at this chunk and say, what happens when these two go together? Because that wasn't written with one chunk. It had many chunks. So you got this chunk, then you get this chunk, and you agree to yourself on the meaning of this, the meaning of this. So now you can put them together, and go on, right?
Yeah,
I've never translated like that, so I don't really know what I'm talking about, but that's what it
well,
seems to me.
I think you're speaking to a little bit to style too. I liked what you're saying, that the chunk is just the beginning. It's like you could render the chunks in a really boring, non-readable fashion so that it's not a good translation that way either. It's like an eloquent rendering of the chunks, probably, or a stylized rendering of the chunks. That's where it is a new text. Like each translator is going to stylize that meaning, differently. Like if you and I are interpreting for the same deaf person, like we're going to have a different style, you know.
Yes,
Eh,
yes, and if we're working together in the same room, when I see you sign something specific, I'm going to probably copy that so that the deaf client sees the same sign again. You've decided, you make a decision about uh, Mangelwurzel, and that's what you sign. So I'm not going to come up with anything else because that person knows that that's the sign for Mangelwurzel. So I'm going to use the same thing.
yeah.
So it's an agreed upon thing.
Yeah, it'd be like if you and I were translating Valens together as a team, and one of us was like, okay, when this word comes up, let's use, classification, not sect. If you started using sect, then the reader would be lost. Like, what does this mean? Because it's like we already decided and informed the reader that it was diurnal and nocturnal classification. Like, that would be an
Right.
intrusion, or some, it would be an error kind of to do that.
And it would, yes, I think so. And I think one of the ills of that kind of thinking is that the reader is going along enjoying themselves, and all of a sudden they get to this thing, and it's like somebody pumping the brakes a little bit. It took me out of it. What am I looking at? Where was I? How do I get back to the flow that I had before? So you don't want to do that.
Well, in publishing at the Moira Press, there's something we call a stop line, which is when the reader stops reading. Or it's like a stop line in a song is when the listener stops listening. And we basically try to have a no stop line in any book that we ever create. And so one of the reasons my translations are so, I think, flawless is that whenever we got to a stop line, I'm like, I gotta fix that. There's something stopping the reader right here. Oh, they don't know what a floof and floppen is. Oh, I got to, I
Yeah,
love,
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, I agree. I mean, um, when I write, I often read what I wrote aloud because
Mhm.
I think you'll find the snags that way.
Oh, totally. Yeah, knits we call the, yeah, like, yeah, and we did that with the Tetrabiblos. We read every word out loud, me and the editor, and like then when something's wrong, you notice it, kind of thing.
Very clear.
So let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Are our clients or texts equally easy or hard to interpret for why or why not?
Small question. Um, no, each personality is different, so that makes each person different to interpret. And the texts are different. I mean, you and I have done Algebra 60 and we're just line. And so that's pretty easy text for us. In fact, Algebra 30 in my interpreting career was the first time after doing a million of them that I started to think about what I was going to have for dinner and if I had to stop at the grocery store on the way home. Because I had done so many of them, it was pretty easy. That was the first time, and I thought, oh my God, look at me. I'm thinking about what I'm doing after. But I was still true to it. The client understood what I was doing. So I think, and then, we do child psychology, 400 level child psychology class, it's going to be a struggle. I do a lot more prep. You do too, I'm sure. A lot more prep. You try to figure out how you can make it accessible.
Hmm.
So that's different. And then each client is different. Um,
Have you ever met a deaf person that was impossible to interpret for?
yes, people that men mostly that don't give you anything. They don't let you know if you're right or not. And it's not their responsibility to do that. I understand that. Because if you're a hearing person listening to a hearing speaker in the audience, it's not your responsibility to go. It's just not. But people who look at you like you're not even there and don't give you anything back, I find pretty hard to interpret.
Interesting.
And I hate to say make gender stereotypes, but it more often happens to me with men. A woman will either be bored, excited about the information, understanding the information, but they'll let you know.
Yeah. Well,
I
okay.
think the hardest I can summarize this by saying the hardest person to interpret for is a person where you feel no linguistic connection.
Well, and that's where it comes into sending over thought pictures, where you're like, you'll be talking, you're like, do you know, like blah 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 blah, and then Fluffenhofen, and then I'm
Yeah,
asking you, do you
that's
know what
right.
it
That's
is?
right.
And then you nod and you say yes, and I can keep going. But if you say, I don't know what that is, then I have to expand there, and then before I
Yeah,
go, it's like language is actually a loop, and so if the person's not giving us any feedback, we actually don't know what to do. Like that's actually,
right.
yeah. Okay, wait.
Yeah, and that's true. And that's true in hearing culture too. If if you're in a group and you say, you won't believe this, but yesterday I woke up and I was bleeding from the ears for 2 hours, and one of those people, or even all of them, they don't say anything to you. You're stuck. You don't know what to do. You don't know how to proceed.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Hey, so okay, you actually brought up a really good point that made me have an epiphany. Okay, so you're saying it's the person that makes it hard, but also the text or what it is. Okay, so here's the same author, Porphyry of Tyre. And this was the first book I translated, was the introduction to Tetrabiblos. And look at this. He has all these little sections. So he's like, on the 10th, or turning away. So he's like turning away, and then he goes on to what does turning away mean. He's like basically delineating like collection. What does collection mean? Okay, this was actually very easy to interpret because I knew that what he was doing, he was defining the term collection, and these sentences would be defining that term, right? So that was actually
Right.
pretty easy for me as a new translator to do this, right? Well, then Porphyry of Tyre also wrote this essay on how the soul gets in the body. And it's just this really long essay that's super, super hard. Like this thing took me 7 years. This one maybe took me like 1 year. This took me 7 years.
Wow. Because there's no side conversations.
Well, it's not a technical text. It's a poetic text, right? So it's like oh, and then what if the soul gets dead? And like, and it's just and it was like it just took me, I had to read it over and over and over again for 7 years to make a lot of those poetic decisions of like, I was, what does he mean here? And then I read later in the text, oh, back there he meant this. Okay, now I'm gonna maybe translate like this because it's hard to explain, but it's like
Yeah.
the poem kind of had to reveal itself over 7 years because it's like a long essay poem. Whereas this one, I was like, oh, okay, I get what he's saying, but that was like the same author, different text.
But that, to me, that seems, I mean, that's a gift. The one that took you 7 years to interpret or to translate, that's a gift because you got to think about it for 7 years. You got to pour over it and sip it for 7 years. It's like reading a book of poetry compared to instructions for how to put a screen door together. Of
Exactly.
course, 2 minutes, and you don't want to ever pour over,
Interesting.
but read the poetry and you're like, man, I don't want this to end.
Yeah. Well, kind of. Yeah. Do I look at those years translating as a gift? No. It's like torture. But being a tortured artist is a thing, you know. I'm not going to complain, but my chart's not writing another book until 27, so I'm stoked about that.
2027?
Yeah, I only write a book when my chart makes me. Um,
Well, that's
okay. So do it. Okay, do ASL interpreters ever try to come up with a definitive translation? Why or why not?
I think some do. I I don't. And for the same reason, I think if if I come up with a definitive, this is I'm going back to elementary. I worked in elementary for a number of years, and so if you um, are reading a book about a bear running through the woods, and you come up with one way to say it, and that's the one you use every single time the teacher reads that story, everybody's bored. If you come up with different ways, and I often act it out a little bit, but you come up with different ways of saying things, you have people interested, and none of those are wrong.
Mm. Well, okay, this question comes from when I was young. A friend of mine were working on the Valens thing together, and he was trying to create a definitive translation of Valens, and we were working on the book together, and he was going to be writing footnotes and stuff like that, and like it was like hard because in order to make a definitive translation, he and I would have had to agree on every translation decision, and the whole group of astrologers would have had to agree. Like it's like, can there really be a definitive translation of a text? Because I feel like that question or that journey is inflammatory.
I think so too. I think that um, I would prefer to say the most definitive translation of the text at this time,
Hmm.
because in interpreting, the idea is that whatever interpretation you just finished was good at the time, the next one you do will be better, or it will be more effective, or it'll be something. But if you say, I did that, I don't ever have to do that again, then the next time you do it, you'll be just pulling the old clothes out of the drawer, and it'll be boring.
Well, yeah, it's funny because when we were young, I was like, "Oh yeah, let's do a definitive translation." But the older me is like thinking that is actually the wrong thing to be trying to do. Like it's better to have these multiple translations of Valens and then let the readers enjoy the multiplicity of it, and they do the journey of discovering all Valens through those several translations. You know.
I
Um
think that's great. Yeah.
well, okay, so it makes me think of what if there was a deaf person who is the president of the United States? How would they go about creating the state? Let's say they made a State of the Union address. How would they go about making sure it was a good translation, whoever voice interpreted that State of the Union? Would they try to make a definitive translation of the State of the Union? Like, how would they approach making a really good translation of the State of the Union?
Well, I think that um, I thought about this earlier because of your question, but I think that you would have to have a team of interpreters discuss everything they know about and it's a frozen text. In other words, the president gets it a few hours, or maybe a week before, and so the interpreters would have to have it too, and they would pour over every decision um, about how to sign some of the euphemisms in the state of so casualties. They'd have to decide how to sign casualties, and they would all have to come up with a way to do it and agree on it. And then they would pick the person best suited to a broad audience, the person who's not strictly ASL, not strictly English, but somewhere in the middle, because that's the cross section of the people that are going to be watching. And they would have to pick the interpreter best suited. But they would also have, I think the big thing is they would have to, as a team, bring all their perspectives to the translation, the interpretation of it.
Mhm.
And then they would have to say, that's it, we'll do it that way.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So it's like I think if this person wanted to make a definitive translation at this point in his career, because he's a historian and he's studied Valens a lot, like what he would need to do is to assemble a team of people who, so maybe Riley's on the team, he made the other translation of Valens, and I'm on the team, and Schmidt's team is on the team, so there's three of us who can read Valens. All three of us sit down with a team of historians. It's like a dream team, and
Yeah.
then you get the best of the best, the heavy hitters, and then you go in and make the decisions together.
Yes. Knowing that you're probably not going to agree on, and you'll probably have huge arguments about very pedantic things in the text. But I feel like all of that's necessary to get the best out of the 3 or 4 of you that are there.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, if there are no arguments, you're probably not doing a great job.
Yeah, totally. And that's why I feel like making a definitive translation. And then I would also want to include like the astrology community at large. Like I would want to say, like, what do you, okay, we have these, we're fighting over these two or debating over these two options. What do you all think? And then if the groups voted, then we decided on the one that gets the most votes. That's a definitive translation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like, see how
Yeah.
the process is just way more impossible than to just allow there to be a few translations and let people do that journey on their own.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay.
It's-
Okay. Do sign language interpreters compete with each other? Why or why not?
Well, I think they do. I haven't experienced a lot of this, but I think they do. And I've been with interpreters that will say, "Oh, you sign it that way," which means I think the way I signed it is right. So yours is not quite right. They're not saying yours is different. But often, I I've heard that. I think they must. I think people in specific disciplines must be competitive. Like medical interpreters are probably competitive. Musical interpreter, legal interpreter, probably competitive.
So you think we're competitive to make the field better, or like I don't really experience where I'm at a job and me and my team are competing. We're usually just like I do my 20 and then they do their 20 and I'm like
Yeah.
we don't really compete like that.
No, I don't. I've never felt that working with a team. Um, I think we're focused on the work.
Yeah.
It's like in theater. You have a lot of egos because they're actors, but if everyone, even with their egos, is focused on the text, you get a good interpretation of the text. And I
Yeah.
think most of the teams that I've had, well, I've worked predominantly with you and Heather White and some other great interpreters, and so absolutely focused on the text. What we want is immaterial compared to what we want is for the text to be valid.
This is so interesting that
So
you say that because we are humble servants to the text, and every good interpreter I know, like I was a humble servant to Valens. You know why the covers you can't read what's on the cover? Because in book 6 he puts an oath where he protects all the books for the uninitiated, and I'm like, I'm a humble servant to this text. They're not for the uninitiated, so I covered them all. You know?
yeah, no, I agree. I think that's great. That's great. I'm glad to know that because I wondered what you
Yeah.
picked wallpaper. But yes, that's great. Uh,
Well,
and that's
the
true for.
first edition had it on there, and then I got to book 6, and I went back and fixed it. You know, after learning.
But that one isn't bad either.
Yeah, no.
But it's like Shakespeare. You have to read what's in the text, and and directors who were like, what if they were all crippled? What if it was in space? That you can go off the rails, and that's not the text.
That would be That's a meta text or like some kind of, that's a different art form when you build something else on the text. Drag queens do this all the time. They'll take a song and
Yeah,
sing to it, and it changes the subtext of the song to be like sexual or something like that.
that's right. Right. There's a lot of wink wink in there. And I love that,
Yeah.
but they're not saying that they're that singer. They're not trying to convince you that they are, I don't know, PJ Harvey. You can hear PJ Harvey and you say, "Oh, I know that's PJ Harvey," and that's not a song that a drag queen, any PJ Harvey song, probably not a song a drag queen would do. But they're not saying that. They're saying, "I'm interpreting this, and this is my own thing."
Yeah, totally. Interesting. Man, I'm so glad you were willing to do this with me.
This is fun. I love thinking about all this stuff.
I know this is what's cool about the sign language interpreters I know is like if the astrologers knew how intensely we think about translation, they would probably trust my translation a lot more. It's like they don't know me from Adam, but like you and I have been tripping on these tiny decisions for years, you know?
That's right. We have, and then thinking about them afterwards, after we make the decision. I mean, I also have to ask the people that are criticizing you, like, how valid are they? If I make an interpretation and some hearing person who doesn't understand sign language comes up to me and says, I don't think you did a really good job. I would say, like, and you're who?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, there are points like there's this place called the Skyscraper Forum where a lot of Hellenistic astrologers hang out, and like recently, like one of them kind of critiqued a little word I chose in this one point in the text, and I went back and looked at it, and I agree with them. I actually agree that I kind of made an error there, but I think it depends on who's talking, right? Like if it's just yeah, I think it depends who's talking. And I don't mind having my translations critiqued a little bit nowadays because I realize that translating is an imperfect art form. And no matter how well you do it, like, no, there's no perfect translation ever. It's like, it's just like a big try, it's like I tried,
yeah.
and
But
yeah,
it also depends on how the criticism comes
yeah,
around. And if a person says, well, I wouldn't show this word is okay, but I think that the real meaning of this is this. So I think that maybe that would be a more accurate word instead of I don't like this word you use. I would have used this.
right, right.
It depends on who and how.
Yeah, it's true. I think there's also, if I was being totally honest, like I think my translation doesn't get as much visibility because I didn't release my translation open source online and Riley did. So a lot more people have access to the Riley version because it's open source and mine's not. Like mine's expensive, but I mean, that's because I don't know, it's just a different product, I
Yeah,
guess. But I'm not going to release mine open source. But so I think Riley gets touted as like the right translation or the better translation because more people have seen it.
yeah,
But that's okay. Mine can be the what do you call that? Like the boutique artisanal
yeah.
translation or something.
The esoteric academic translation.
Ooh, I like that. I'm writing that down. So knowing me, this is kind of a question that I just thought of now. So knowing me as a sign language interpreter, would you trust my translation of Valens?
Absolutely. And I don't know, is who's going to watch this?
What? Who's gonna watch this?
Yeah,
I have no.
anybody going to watch this? Nobody.
Oh yeah.
Well, I would just say that you're a great interpreter. You're a fantastic interpreter, and I've never ever interpreted with you and watched you do something and said, "Oh, I wouldn't have done it that way." I never felt that.
Yeah.
I think you're a phenomenal interpreter. So, of course, I would absolutely trust anything that you poured your heart and soul into as your best work.
Yeah, totally. That means so much to me because like with all the critiques I've gotten and you have to understand that I'm I'm not making this up. It took me 15 years to translate Valens and for the duration of 15 years they called me crazy for everything I did because I came in I was kind of a rogue scholar like coming in and they thought, what is she doing? And I'm like, "Oh, I could see Schmidt struggling." And I was like, "I know how to do this. I learned Greek and Latin. I went in, but because, it's like, so I just dealt with being called crazy for 15 years. And it's like, it means the world to me as a sign language interpreter, somebody who actually works with me on a daily level, that I am not crazy. Like I'm literally,
No,
I mean, I am crazy, but not.
well, yeah, I don't know what crazy means, but no, your work is valid. Your work is informed. You're a brilliant interpreter.
Yeah. Yeah, that means I think you're a brilliant interpreter too. One of the things I love about you and your charge, like you're kind of theatrical. We're really good at like affect. Like we haven't even talked about what is affect.
Well, I'm a mediocre interpreter, but affect has saved my interpreting.
So affect,
Affect and uh, register have have made some of my interpretations much better looking than they actually are.
you're funny. Affect for the viewers is like kind of adding that tone. Like we have the chunk, and now we're getting the tone, style, and mood of the chunk. Would you think
Yeah,
that's affect?
that's right. That's accurate. So uh,
Let's say it's a
it's the
long.
difference between a hearing person saying, "I'll be there Thursday," and someone saying, "I'll be there Thursday." That's
Yeah.
what we do. We find that exactly match, trying to exactly match what they say. That's their affect. We're matching it.
Totally. So one of the things about Valens is he's kind of morbid, and he'll be like, this is the chart of a town executioner, and like this is the chart of a dead baby, and like he's just like really, he's a Scorpio, and he's like really dark, and he's a little bit on the horror side, and like, I loved matching his affect and just being like kind of morbid, because I love like horror and stuff like that. So I had a
Yeah.
really fun time with him. Whereas in Ensoulment, I had to match the affect of Porphyry. And one of the reasons I read so many books in Greek, like the Bible and things, is I was studying affect. Like because Porphyry has a totally different style of writing and talking than Valens has. And then
Mm.
also the Tetrabiblos is another book I translated, and that has a different style. So I think affect I got to a little bit later in my career, where I was just like, oh my God, you can kind of see how they are. Um, so yeah. What would
It saves me sometimes from a bad interpretation, because I feel like, and especially in theater, if I can get the affect and register of the person speaking, it's a way in. Then the signs will come.
hmm. Well, especially in theater where the point of the text is to entertain. If you're not getting affect, you're not really doing your job.
Right,
Because it's not
right,
yeah, it's about the words, but it's really about the entertaining character that you're portraying.
right, right. And they're trying to act. So if you're not doing that, then you're not matched.
Totally. So what is register?
And register is let's translate it into hearing. Like uh the corporate need for this is one register. The corporate need for this is that the revenue has to be increased by the 30th of July. That's one register. The other register is by the end of the month, we need more money.
Okay, so register is the formality of language. So like a
Yeah,
frozen text like the Lord's Prayer is very high register, where it's just like
yeah.
God grant me or whatever. But like yeah, like so if let's say like Valens is kind of more colloquial register, because he was a living walking astrology. He actually read charts. He was just a guy. Whereas
What
um
class was he in?
what class?
Social class. Yeah,
That's a
what
good
social?
question. I don't know. That's a great question. That's where the historians know more than I do. Like, and that's why I'd love to be on a dream team with those guys, because they would teach me that stuff. But like the Tetrabiblos written by Ptolemy, that was like he was a professor. He wrote like the Almagest, which was a text on astronomy, and he wrote all these books. He was a college professor, so his affect is more like scholarly, whereas Valens is register, sorry, register is more
Register.
scholarly, whereas Valens's register is more colloquial. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's the way I would see it.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
like like you and I interpret like really when we're on the phone lines, we interpret some really informal register.
Yes.
Like, yo, what's up? Yo, give me a call.
Yeah.
Like, that's really informal register.
Right. Where's my money?
And if you
I
make it,
told, or I told you I was gonna pull that transmission on Thursday. We get that all the time.
totally. And if you interpret it in a more formal register, is that an error?
Yeah.
Right. So you got to be like, where my money? Like, you got to show that. Like, you can't be like, where's my money? Like, right.
I don't know if it's an error. Conversely, if you froze for a second there. Conversely, if somebody's speaking like a professor, um, I'm sorry to laugh, but it just said my internet connection was unstable, so I'm I'm going to go get the internet connection some Valium. Um, yeah, if you have a professor talking about balance, uh, it's not going to be the same register, and you have to match that. That's more of a challenge, because our everyday language is colloquial.
Yeah, this is so good. This is so good. Like, this is the stuff that I wish that on the team of Hellenistic astrologers, they would see me as the dream team translator, because like I know about register affect, like all this stuff, and
Yeah,
this is what you and I do this every day. We get paid to do this 40 hours a week, right? Well, this is what we
yeah,
do. And
yeah,
so wouldn't you want somebody who's paid to translate to be your dream team translator? It's like,
yes.
you
And
know,
I know that you keep all that stuff in mind, even though it's not ASL. You're translating text. I know you have all that stuff in your head. But
absolutely. 100%. Okay, we have 10 minutes. Let me see.
are these just good for an hour and a half? These
No, I
Zoom
just I
things?
just have a plan at 5:30.
Oh, okay.
Do you ever let's see? Well, is there anything you think that the astrologers should know?
About translating texts. Um, well, no, I'm at a loss. I would say what I've been reading about. I've been reading Proust. I've been reading about Proust, and I've been reading about translations of Proust. There's a newish one out, and comparison is really important to all of these people who are writing. So comparison is really tantamount to how they look at their work. The very first person who translated Proust was Moncrief. All of these people talk about Moncrief. Without Moncrief, they're at sea.
Yeah.
But they use Moncrief as their rudder to steer them to the next translation. So
That's
comparison is important.
That's beautiful, because that's where I'm getting now, that Riley's been out for so long and mine have been out for so long. I'm writing in a lecture as we read book one on Thursdays. We're doing comparisons. The group likes to compare them, and I'm gonna write a lecture on like Valens book one translation comparison, where we go in and we compare them, because that is the next moment of scholarship, is where you look at both translations and compare.
Yeah, right. And that's uh, scholarship is really the important thing. I think that you are after scholarship.
Yes.
You're not translating for some uh, baseball player in the dugout to read when he's not on or she's not on the first base. You're translating for scholarship.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it's frustrating because I'm an emotional person. Like, my moon is in Pisces and I'm an emotional person. And I think a lot of the scholars in astrology they have more flat affect charts. And so I think some of them don't take me very seriously, because I am an emotional person, and you see me in my purple rain shirt. I'm not like super formal, but that's because I'm old and I'm living off my life's work. Like, I don't need to dress up in order to prove myself. Like, my work proves itself. Like,
Right.
but it's funny, because in sign language interpreting, I'm a sought after musical interpreter. Like, I've done Iron Maiden, Metallica, um I've done Ringo Starr. I've done Guns N' Roses. I mean, I've done some of the biggest concerts, and you want a Pisces moon up there translating music. Like I'm
That's right.
like you can have a scholar
Right.
who is emotional, and that doesn't make them less scholarly. I mean, what do you think of
No. No, and so I'm using some of my own examples, but scholarly written well is really important. And one of the things I'm reading now is a thesis that someone wrote about the crossover between Proust and Immanuel Kant. So it reads like an academic thesis. It's dull as dishwater. It doesn't pull anybody through it. And I'm interested in some of the concepts, but it's written for people who will write that kind of thing. It's not written for anyone else. And this person that I downloaded this from at the University of Chicago is probably thrilled that somebody's reading their work because they never expected anybody to read it. It's a scholarly work for academics, but I think that a scholarly work needs to be for more than just academics.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm kind of like the people's translator. You know what I mean? It's like they call it the poetic translation for a reason. It's like, yeah, I got the affect of Valens. I got how poetic he is. I got his affect. He's
Yeah,
awesome, you know? But
yeah, but
it's like,
that's still scholarly.
yeah,
I'm pointing. I guess it's not good. It's still scholarly.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, there are there are musicians who are scholars, you know? There are
yes,
you know, they know music theory, but they're still musical.
yes, absolutely. Randy Newman's a great example of that. Randy Newman is from a dynasty of composers dating back to the 20s. Everybody in his family, and yet he writes very popular music for Disney films. There isn't anything he doesn't know about music.
Yeah.
Same thing with the Marsalis family. They're all music scholars,
Hmm.
but they play jazz.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna lean into being the more watery emotional scholar in astrology, and that's fine, you know?
I believe that's probably something that's missing from astrology scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there are people that with scholarly work, they say, oh man, this is important. And every word I write, I want to make people know that this is important. And so it gets dry.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. Well, I appreciate you coming on here so much.
Yeah.
Of all the people, all the interpreters, I thought, you know, you are so poetic and arty yourself, and I like just couldn't wait to get on here and talk to you. And this has been
This
so
was
enlightening.
so much fun. It was so much fun. I love thinking about this with you. I love how we go back and forth with each other, but that's great.
Do you want to do an episode 2?
Sure. You'll have to come up with, I'm going to let you drive. So you'll have to come up with other things to ponder.
Okay, I'll think of 20 more questions and then we can do episode 2.
Okay. And so, how much are we talking about sign language interpreting and translation? Is it like 50-50?
I think it really, yeah, it's all of it. I think the target audience for these videos is astrologers, though.
Okay. Then,
But I think ASL interpreting students, like we have one interpreting student at the school, and I bet she'll watch these too, you know. Um, but yeah, I think they'll be beneficial for several people. But we're talking to astrologers about translation.
I think that's great. And, in the broader context, any discussion of translation is pretty important.
Yeah. What do you think
So
we should call this video?
I don't know. Trying to think of something clever, but I may not be clever enough.
How about
Uh,
translation talk for the Hellenistic astrologers?
that sounds great. Is that
Where,
your target audience?
yeah, totally. Okay. All right, Alexander. Well, I love
All
you
right.
so much.
Thanks. I love you. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, I can't wait.
That's cool. All right. Have fun tonight.